Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and drop a quick comment before we get started. Also, don't forget to tap that notification bell and turn on all notifications, since this is the only way to ensure you'll find out about my new content. The greatest mystery in modern British history doesn't involve complex espionage or an elaborate heist. Instead, it began with a British lord, a heavy lead pipe, and Sandra Rivet, an unfortunate nanny caught up in a dispute which she had no part in. Imagine the scene. A man who was a peer of the realm, vanishing overnight from the heart of London, leaving behind an act of horrifying evil. This was the fate of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, better known to the world and to history as Lord Lucan. He was a dashing, charismatic aristocrat, a fixture of high society, so effortlessly suave, he was reportedly considered for the role of James Bond. Yet, on the night of November 7th, 1974, that gilded image dissolved into a terrifying reality. Lucan's high social standing and the brutality of the crime instantly guaranteed the scandal's status as a global phenomenon. What followed was an intense and unsuccessful manhunt, followed by decades of rampant speculation. The mystery of Lord Lucan endures not because the facts are scarce, but because the truth remains trapped between the evidence and the tantalizing possibility of a high society conspiracy. To understand the disappearance, we must first look at the man behind it all. Richard John Bingham, who held the title of Lord Lucan, had a typical aristocratic upbringing, attending Eton College and serving briefly with the legendary Coldstream Guards. Following his military service, he became a banker in London. However, he quickly gave up this career to dedicate himself fully to high-stakes gambling. He became an early and persistent member of the exclusive group of wealthy gamblers at the Claremont Club, where his expensive tastes were well known. Despite adopting the nickname Lucky Lucan, his luck was decidedly finite, and the name became ironic. His losses were crushing, and he ran up immense gambling debts, sometimes losing amounts as high as £10,000, forcing his uncle to intervene to cover his creditors. While he continued to live the high life in both Britain and the United States for a few years, the reality of his financial insolvency eventually caught up with him. His personal life was similarly troubled. Lucan's marriage to Veronica Duncan, which began in 1963, soon became characterized as grimly unhappy. Veronica struggled with mental health issues, including anxiety and postnatal depression, following the births of their 3 children. By late 1972, the relationship had collapsed, and Lucan moved out of the family home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Keep that address in mind, because it's going to come up again. This separation sparked an intensely bitter and public custody battle over their children. The subsequent court ruling in 1974 proved devastating to the Earl. Despite doctors testifying that Lady Lucan was suffering from depression, the judge ultimately granted her full custody, restricting Lucan to visitation every other weekend. This total loss of control over his family, coupled with immense financial strain from his debts and the legal obligation to support his estranged family, sent him spiraling. He entered into a state of furious obsession, and slowly but surely he became a dangerous stalker. He began to spy on his wife and record their telephone conversations, fixated solely on regaining custody. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this disturbingly obsessive behavior manifested itself into a very dark plot. Lucan had convinced himself that his wife was the primary source of all his troubles. Friends admitted they had conversations with Lucan in which he explicitly expressed a desire to eliminate her. For him, removing Veronica from the chessboard was a horrific solution that he believed would allow him to get his children back and regain control of his house and finances. So he started planning, but like many plans, this one wouldn't work out quite how he imagined it. The carefully premeditated plan unraveled almost the moment it began, derailed by a routine of aristocratic household management. Lucan was waiting in the basement kitchen of 46 Lower Belgrave Street, expecting to find his wife alone, as he understood the family nanny, Sandra Rivet, had her usual night off. However, Rivet was unexpectedly covering for another employee in the household that evening, and was somewhere that other employee wouldn't have been. When Sandra went downstairs to the kitchen around 9 p.m., she encountered the Earl in the darkness, which totally made him change his course. Rivet was bludgeoned to death with a piece of lead piping wrapped in surgical tape. Sandra Rivet, a mother herself, was only 30 years old. When Lady Lucan went downstairs to investigate why the nanny hadn't brought up tea, she was ambushed at the top of the basement stairs. She was viciously attacked, but she managed to struggle free, possibly by pretending that she would turn over everything to him. Wounded and covered in blood, Lady Lucan fled frantically from the house and burst into the nearby Plumber's Arms pub around 10 that night. She was screaming for help, identifying her own husband as the assailant, and declaring that he had slain Sandra. The alarm was raised immediately. Lucan, recognizing that his catastrophic failure meant imminent exposure and arrest, began his brief flight. He first telephoned his mother, requesting that she collect the children from the house. He then drove a borrowed Ford Corsair to the home of his friends, Susan and Ian Maxwell Scott, in Uckfield, East Sussex, arriving around 1:15 that morning. During his time at the house, he composed several notes, which revealed his conflicted state of mind. He wrote 2 letters to his brother-in-law, William Shand, attempting to set up a flimsy cover story that he had surprised an intruder attacking his wife and fled in panic. Crucially, he wrote a separate note to his friend, Michael Stoop, alluding to a, quote, traumatic night of unbelievable circumstances. He asked Stoop to tell his children that Lucan had known him and cared only for them. The despairing finality of this letter suggested a man accepting his fate, overriding the attempt at a formal cover-up contained in the other letters. Unusually, the Scotts waited a highly suspicious 2 days before they contacted the authorities. Lucan's car was discovered abandoned in New Haven, 16 miles from Uckfield, 2 days after the attack. Witnesses stated the car had been parked there sometime between 4 and 8 on the morning after. The time gap between his 1:15 a.m. departure from Uckfield and the car's placement has been subject to intensive speculation. The interior of the car was found stained with type AB blood, potentially consistent with a mixture of blood from both Lady Lucan and Sandra Rivet. Most damningly, investigators found the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence in the trunk. There was a piece of lead piping, identical to the weapon used in the attack, alongside a full bottle of vodka. The overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence led to an immediate warrant for the arrest of this now disgraced member of the House of Lords. Unusually, the chief detective on the case immediately publicly expressed doubt that Lord Lucan drove the vehicle to New Haven. Instead, he suggested that an accomplice may have placed the vehicle there, for reasons which I'll get to in a moment. Despite the vanishing, legal proceedings continued. In 1975, the inquest jury, convening in Lucan's absence, formally found him guilty for his killing of Sandra. This was an event of profound gravity, marking the first time a member of the House of Lords had been convicted of such a severe crime since 1760. And as a quick aside, since I can't help myself, in that case a member of the House of Lords killed his butler in cold blood. His peers in the House of Lords, who worked with him and knew him and his family, sentenced him to death, in an effort to quell the uproar and preserve aristocratic power. Lucan's disappearance immediately splintered into two dominant opposing theories. He ended himself, or there was a high society escape. Notably, there's also a bizarre fringe theory involving a framing adding further complexity, which I'll discuss briefly as well, just for completeness' sake. The strongest evidence that he voluntarily ended his own life rests on the logic of the situation and the physical trail. Lucan was exposed, financially destroyed, and facing public condemnation. Self-destruction offered a definitive escape from justice. Further, Lucan must have been aware that any trial would threaten the ongoing privilege of the ancient aristocracy. After all, this was a clear case of a powerful and influential lord who slew an innocent common woman in cold blood. The car was abandoned in New Haven, a port town, and the final letter to Stoop possessed the unmistakable tone of a farewell. His friends publicly went on record saying they believed he had taken a motorboat into the English Channel and smashed it up on the rocks, drowning in the process. Some investigators believe this as well, though no evidence was ever found to prove such a theory. There was no body, there was no smashed-up boat, there was nothing whatsoever, only the vast void of the English Channel. The possibility of escape, however, has captivated the public imagination for decades, largely fueled by Lucan's powerful circle of friends. Lucan was a privileged member of the Claremont Set, a group of wealthy and influential figures who were suspected of facilitating his flight. Police investigations quickly ran into a frustrating wall of silence, suggesting powerful figures were actively hindering the hunt. The Claremont Set included prominent figures such as casino owner John Aspinall and businessman Sir James Goldsmith, both of whom were strongly suspected of helping Lucan evade justice. The most interesting claim for Lucan's survival emerged years later, though it must be clear that this claim is an allegation at present. A woman who had worked for Aspinall claimed in 2012 that she was instructed to book flights for Lucan's two eldest children to Africa. These flights, specifically to Kenya and Gabon, occurred between 1979 and 1981. Her instructions were to facilitate arrangements for, quote, John Bingham, also known as Lord Lucan, to see his children. However, there's a weird twist here. These were arranged as safari trips by Aspinall as a kind gesture to the children of his departed friend. She never claimed that the children themselves had actually been there to see their dad. Rather, they were there to be watched. She claimed the purpose was for Lucan to secretly observe his children during safaris without their knowledge. Lord Lucan did have a history of stalking and making secret observations, so if this is true, I guess old habits die hard. This account, if true, suggests Aspinall and Goldsmith maintained prolonged, regular contact with the fugitive for at least 7 years after the attack. But as you may have noticed, I've been saying if this is true a lot. And the fact is that there's been absolutely no evidence produced to support these allegations. This belief in Lucan's exile has fueled continuous international sightings in locations ranging from Portugal to Australia to various parts of Africa. In 2020, Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, championed the assertion that Lucan was living as an elderly Buddhist monk in a commune near Brisbane, Australia. This monk was subject to some pretty intense speculation for 2 years, and for reasons that will soon become obvious, I'm not going to show his picture here. In 2022, the man agreed to cooperate with British investigators who used DNA testing to rule him out. A final, highly controversial counter-narrative suggests that Lady Lucan herself was the killer and framed her husband. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that a small amount of Lady Lucan's blood, as well as rivets, was present at the scene. Lady Lucan claimed that this was because her psychotic husband, who was lurking in the basement, tried to bludgeon her as well, a narrative that most people accept as valid. Furthermore, a medical doctor testifying at the inquest conceded that while highly unlikely, it was possible that Lady Lucan's head injuries could have been self-inflicted. This theory holds that Lord Lucan, the guy who was stalking and harassing his wife and family, took the fall for a crime committed by Lady Lucan. Personally, I don't think this theory has the air of reality at all, and I suspect it was just whipped up to sell a book or move tabloids from newsstands. As time has gone on, I think it's clear that it's more and more likely that Lord Lucan died on November 8, 1974. The British courts eventually acknowledged this as a reality, granting the family probate over his estate in 1999. He was declared officially dead in 2016, clearing the way for his son to become the 8th Earl of Lucan. It's the deepest, darkest hour of a Minnesota spring night. You're on the phone with your teenage son whose car got stuck in a ditch, guiding him to safety, convinced he's just minutes away. 47 minutes into that anxious conversation, mid-sentence, your son suddenly screams out an expletive. The line goes dead, and the silence that follows is so absolute it eclipses all the noise and distress that came before it. This is the chilling climax of a real-life disappearance that has baffled investigators for over a decade and a half. It's the case of the mysterious disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Brandon Swanson was, by all measures, an intelligent, dependable, and much-loved young man. Born in Marshall, Minnesota, in 1989, he grew up in a close-knit family environment in an area known for its tranquil agricultural setting. The night of May 13, 2008, was supposed to be a triumph. He'd just completed his certificate in renewable energy and wind turbines at a local junior college. He was excitedly looking forward to moving over 250 miles away to attend Iowa Western College, embarking on the next step in his education. That night, Brandon had stayed in Canby, where his college campus was located, to celebrate the end of the academic year with friends. He attended a few small gatherings and was seen consuming alcohol, but friends indicated that he didn't appear visibly intoxicated. He departed for the 30-mile drive home to Marshall sometime between 12 and 12:30 a.m. His parents have since confirmed that when he called them later, his speech was coherent and not slurred at all. The drive home was along a familiar route, Highway 68, which he took daily. Shortly after midnight, sometime before 2 a.m., Brandon's journey ended prematurely. His green Chevy Lumina slid off a gravel road and got stuck in the approach to a farmer's field. The car wasn't wrecked, but at that moment, it made little difference. Brandon, uninjured, called his parents, Annette and Brian, for help. The initial interaction was centered on a massive geographical error. Brandon was convinced he was just 10 minutes away from their home, near the small town of Lind, which lies about 7 miles southwest of his home in Marshall. Annette and Brian immediately drove their pickup truck toward Lind. They attempted to use their headlights to signal Brandon, and they could hear Brandon flashing his own lights on the other end of the line. But the impenetrable rural darkness swallowed their efforts. It wasn't until police analyzed cell tower data much later that same day that the catastrophic truth emerged. Brandon hadn't been anywhere near Lind. His phone calls had pinged off a tower near Taunton and Porter, a desolate agricultural area roughly 25 miles northwest of where he thought he was. This was, in fact, in the opposite direction from Marshall completely. This navigational failure is central to the entire case. Brandon, throughout the 47-minute conversation, continued to believe he was close to Lind. Eventually, driven by frustration, Brandon told his father that he was abandoning the car and would walk toward lights he could see in the distance, believing them to be Lind. He instructed his father to drive his mom home and then meet him at a local landmark near Lind. The subsequent 47 minutes saw Brandon walking while maintaining phone contact with his father, Brian. Brandon left the road, taking shortcuts across open fields, trying to save time by traversing fences and moving toward the distant lights. It was during this time that he mentioned the surrounding environment to his father, saying that he was hearing the distinct sound of running water. This sound likely marked his proximity to the Yellow Medicine River, which snakes through the farmland where his car was actually found. As Brandon walked, the situation grew more precarious due to both environmental factors and a specific personal vulnerability. The temperature in the early morning hours of May 14th was dropping quickly, falling to a frigid 39 degrees. Exposure was becoming a significant threat. Compounding this, Brandon had extremely poor eyesight and always wore glasses, which he tragically left behind in the car. His eyesight was so bad in his left eye that it affected his depth perception when not wearing glasses. Walking across unlit, uneven, and unfamiliar rural terrain with compromised depth perception dramatically increased his risk of tripping or misjudging a steep drop-off. The continuous communication with his father was abruptly and terrifyingly severed at approximately 2:30 a.m., 47 minutes into the call. Brian was listening as Brandon suddenly shouted an expletive, and then nothing. The connection didn't immediately drop. Instead, there was an immediate, unnatural silence. It was a truly deafening silence. Brandon's mother, Annette, later recounted that they didn't instantly hang up, but called out his name several times, hoping he could still hear them or retrieve the phone if it was nearby. The frantic parents continued their search, but, unable to find him, notified the police around 6 that morning. Here, the case encountered its first systemic failure. The local authorities initially advised the Swansons to wait, explaining that missing adults often return on their own. Given the circumstances, this seems to be a wildly inappropriate response. Worse yet, it wasn't until the cops actually got involved that Brandon's true location was noted. The discovery of Brandon's Chevy Lumina finally established the correct search area. This vast, flat agricultural landscape quickly became the focus of intense efforts, utilizing helicopters, ground crews, and canine units. The dogs provided the most compelling trajectory of Brandon's final known movements. The search dogs successfully tracked his scent for several miles, following field roads and ultimately paralleling the winding course of the Yellow Medicine River. This corroborates Brandon's own account to his father that he was walking through fields and hearing flowing water. The scent trail eventually went cold precisely at the riverbank, and the dogs were unable to pick up the trail on the far side. The Yellow Medicine River, though generally not considered lethal, was swollen and deep in some sections in mid-May 2008, reaching depths up to 10 feet. The most compelling argument, according to investigators, is that Brandon died from accidental drowning or exposure following an accidental fall into the Yellow Medicine River. The key supporting facts are the canine trail ending at the water and Brandon's comment about hearing running water. His compromised vision and the dark, treacherous terrain made falling into a steep, slick riverbank or a deep drainage ditch quite likely. If the fall was quick, the subsequent silence might be explained by the phone being lost or damaged in mud or still water, or simply muffling the sounds of submersion. Furthermore, if he exited the water, the subsequent rapid onset of hypothermia in the 39-degree weather would explain his failure to be found in subsequent organized searches. That said, it appears unlikely that he got out, since the flat terrain would have made it hard to conceal his body. While this is the theory that investigators prefer, Personally, I think the next theory is more likely, and I'll explain why. A secondary accidental theory centers on an unseen vertical hazard. Brandon was crossing old established farmland, which sometimes features unmarked narrow deep wells. His exclamation could be interpreted as a sudden recognition of an unavoidable, immediate drop. In my view, this scenario best explains the instantaneous disappearance and the permanent removal of Brandon from the landscape, as these hazards can be deep and completely cover a body. But of course, with this scenario, I have to contend with the fact that it doesn't really line up neatly with the sniffer dog evidence. Notably, there is a theory of foul play as well, and investigators haven't fully ruled it out. Under this theory, someone assaulted him from the shadows for some unknown purpose. For what it's worth, the authorities have also come out and said that it's a low crime area where nothing criminal ever happens. In the end, Brandon Swanson's case remains a truly chilling, unsolved mystery, and all I can say for certain is that I don't believe he met with foul play. Hey everyone, just dropping in with a quick shout out to every viewer, subscriber, YouTube member, and patron. Thank you all for being here. Also, if you haven't hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell yet, take a moment to do so, since it really helps my video reach a wider audience. You're sailing the desolate, ice-choked waters near Greenland in 1775 when, through the biting fog, a ship appears. She's weathered and weary, completely sheathed in thick, spectral white ice, yet her tattered sails still hold the wind, propelling her on an endless journey. As you approach, you realize she's entirely silent, her deck barren. When your boarding party breaks below, they find the crew of 28, not missing, but perfectly preserved, locked in the macabre stillness of their final frozen moment. They've been dead for 13 years, but the ship hasn't stopped sailing. This is the legend of the ghost ship Octavius, a story where parsing truth from fiction is the only way to get at the true history that lies within this frozen floating tomb. And as a quick programming note, for this segment, I'll first present the legend as it's usually told, and then discuss the problems with it after. The genesis of this catastrophe lay in a calculated gamble made years earlier. The Octavius, a three-masted schooner, had departed England in late 1761, intending to complete a standard lucrative merchant voyage to the Orient. The ship successfully reached China the following year, traded its goods, and loaded new exotic cargo for the return to British markets. It was at this crucial point when the captain, who is unnamed in most accounts, made the decision that sealed the fate of everyone aboard. The conventional route back required the arduous, time-consuming voyage around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. However, the captain noted unusually mild weather for the season and succumbed to the temptation of the legendary Northwest Passage. This shortcut, winding through the unforgiving Arctic Ocean above North America, had been the obsession of European explorers for centuries. In 1762, it remained an undiscovered and unproven delusion that had already claimed numerous ships and lives. Sailing through the Arctic ice fields was an astronomical risk, especially for a merchant vessel not specifically designed or equipped for polar exploration. The captain's choice represented a severe instance of hubris, prioritizing the distant dream of fame and a faster commercial return over the assured safety of his crew. The Octavius sailed north, attempting to round the northernmost tip of Alaska, near what is now Point Barrow. This was the last known position while the crew was alive. They entered the narrow, frigid straits, expecting glory, but instead found the crushing grip of the sea ice. The log's final entry confirmed the inevitable. By November 11th, 1762, the Octavius was irreversibly trapped. This marked the beginning of its 13-year drift across the top of the world. The crew and passengers, which included the captain's wife and young son, were lost to the Arctic labyrinth. The details of the discovery found by the Herald's boarding party are what cemented the Octavius as an enduring horror story. Below the silent, icy deck, the sailors found the entire complement of 28 individuals frozen in their cabins. The extreme cold had perfectly suspended the moment of their collective demise, creating an unsettling portrait of life instantaneously stopped. The most chilling scene, if you'll pardon the pun, was in the captain's quarters. According to the common accounts, the captain was found seated at his desk, pen poised in his frozen hand, a ghostly record keeper. Open before him lay the ship's logbook. Beside him were the bodies of his wife, as well as his young son, covered only by blankets. The mother had valiantly sacrificed every warm blanket she had in a vain effort to allow her son some quantum of comfort. Following this completely terrifying encounter, the Herald's crew promptly abandoned the Octavius. Carried by the winds and currents, the ice-laden ship disappeared into the night, never to be sighted again, thereby ensuring its permanent place in maritime lore as an unsolved mystery. But there's some problems with this story, starting with the legal context of the time, since British shipping was already highly regulated by the 18th century. When you consider the captain's fateful decision in the context of 18th century maritime law, his actions can be judged as a form of criminal negligence. A captain aboard a British merchant vessel possessed sweeping authority over his ship, crew, cargo, and route. However, this authority was intrinsically linked to a strict duty to the ship's owners and investors, who entrusted him with valuable commercial assets. The Merchant Seaman Act mandated formalized wage contracts and established the captain's obligation to maintain the agreed-upon route, largely to prevent desertion. After all, the men couldn't desert or even mutiny if they knew what they were getting into when they signed up for the trip. The Octavius captain's decision to pursue the Northwest Passage was a catastrophic deviation from his commercial mandate. He gambled the lives of 28 people and the immense value of the cargo on an unproven, highly dangerous exploratory route. By sailing into the Arctic, the captain created a massive hazard, which resulted in its total loss. But this begs the question as to whether a commercial captain could have ever convinced his crew to undertake such a dangerous mission. After all, sailors who signed up for official expeditions to find the Northwest Passage were compensated in accordance with their risk. These sailors weren't compensated for this, and would have likely refused any such order, given how absolutely insane it was. Simply put, in the 18th century, sailors would mutiny under these conditions, and any captain would have known this. This seems as good a time as any to segue into a discussion of whether this often repeated legend is fact or fiction. The central controversy in the Octavius legend lies in the nature of the key piece of physical evidence which doesn't exist: the logbook. The logbook in the 18th century world of seafaring was the official record of navigation, meteorological observations, and ship management. It was intended to provide documentary evidence for the ship's owners of every action undertaken by the captain and crew. However, the narrative of the Octavius's discovery includes a critical complication. When the Herald's boarding party seized the logbook, they found that the cold had deeply penetrated the paper. As they attempted to read beyond the open page which provided the last quote-unquote confirmed details, they accidentally destroyed the logbook. For researchers studying maritime disasters, logs and journals are vital for reconstructing the final movements and decisions of the crew. The lack of verifiable evidence and the inherent contradictions within the logbook narrative have led to a near-unanimous historical consensus. The Octavius is apocryphal folklore. The absence of primary sources confirming the story is telling, and no British ship undertook such a mission without insurance. The Lloyd's List, which maintained detailed shipping registers, hold no record of a vessel by that name, departing or disappearing in the 1760s. And just as a quick aside here, the Lloyd's List was first published in 1734 and is now on volume 63,000. Notably, the Herald, the ship that supposedly found the Octavius, also suffers the same issue. Despite being a whaling ship which would have required significant insurance and for which a paper trail would exist, the primary sources are again completely silent. Furthermore, the story's origins post-date the supposed 1775 discovery by decades, only appearing in print around 1828. Other stories circulated around the same time, essentially telling the same story, but with less details. Many speculate that the Octavius legend was simply a way to flesh out these stories, which were floating around newspapers. After all, adding a series of compelling details makes the story much more likely to sell than a bland narrative about a ship being found. What makes the Octavius stick with me is how it blends ambition, fear, and atmosphere into what effectively amounts to horror. Even knowing it's almost certainly folklore, the imagery is so strong you can't shake it. A ship drifting for over a decade with its crew frozen mid-task feels like the perfect metaphor for human overconfidence meeting the Arctic's absolute indifference. And maybe that's why the story hits so hard. It feels like something that could have happened. Something that fits our psychology for both glory and shortcuts. It's eerie, tragic, and just grounded enough to feel uncomfortably real until you start scratching the surface. It's also further bolstered by the fact that the SS Bechimo is essentially the real 20th century version of this story, but that's a tale for another time.